It was meant to be a happy family dinner in Kampala, Uganda, with roasted plantains on the table and laughter filling the air. But for Amina, 36 and unmarried, it was another test of patience. She was used to her grandmother's sharp tongue, but tonight the sting was harder. Grandma Ruth leaned forward, her eyes full of judgment, and said loudly, "No wonder you're still single at your age." The words cut through the room like a knife, and the sound of chuckles followed. Cousins smirked, uncles whispered about her failed life, and even her younger sister flashed her diamond ring as if to remind everyone of her new marriage. Amina swallowed the pain, forcing herself not to cry, unaware that her 6-year-old daughter Zara was watching everything. When Grandma Ruth laughed again, Zara suddenly slammed her little fork on the table. Her small voice rose with fire, "Maybe she's single because she doesn't want to marry people who laugh at her. My mommy is the strongest and kindest person here. She's not alone, she has me." The whole table went silent. Jaws dropped, a spoon slipped to the floor, and Grandma's face turned pale. For the first time, her power cracked. Amina's heart swelled with pride. Tears filled her eyes, not from shame, but from joy. Her daughter had spoken the truth she never dared to say. That night, as Amina walked out hand in hand with Zara, she felt free. She was no longer defined by her singleness, but by the fearless love of her daughter. Amina sat quietly at the crowded dinner table, trying to hide the storm inside her. She swallowed her pride and forced herself to smile, but her eyes burned with unshed tears. She could hear the whispers just a few seats away, her uncles leaning toward each other, their voices low but sharp enough to wound. Such a shame, 36 and nothing to show. No husband, no real family life. The words felt like stones thrown at her chest. She lowered her gaze, wishing she could disappear, but the humiliation only grew. Her younger sister, sitting right beside her, twisted her diamond ring so it sparkled under the lights. The gesture was deliberate, almost mocking. She tilted her head and laughed softly, making sure Amina noticed the glittering proof of her success. It was a cruel reminder that in everyone's eyes, she was the failure, the woman who had missed her chance. For years, Amina had grown used to these moments. Every family gathering carried the same script: questions about when she would marry, comments about her age, side glances full of pity or ridicule. She had learned to keep silent, to hold her pain inside, because speaking out would only feed their laughter. The label had followed her for so long it felt permanent, the unmarried African woman past her prime. It clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake off, weighing her down, turning her into a joke at her own family's table. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't alone in her silence. Across the table, her 6-year-old daughter Zara sat swinging her small legs, her big eyes observing everything. Zara was young, but she was not blind. She saw the smirks, she heard the cruel jokes, and she noticed the way her mother's shoulders drooped with every mocking word. The child's heart burned with confusion and anger. Why were they treating her mother like this? Why was everyone laughing when her mother was the kindest person she knew? Amina didn't know her daughter was watching so closely. She didn't realize that every insult, every chuckle, was being soaked up by little ears and stored inside a little heart that refused to stay quiet. Zara's tiny hands clenched around her fork, her face tightening with determination. She might have been the youngest one at the table, but in that moment, she carried the courage that no adult dared to show. As the room filled again with Grandma Ruth's cruel laughter, Amina lowered her eyes, bracing herself for another wave of shame. But beside her, something powerful was about to break the silence. Zara's small voice, steady and fierce, was rising inside her chest. She was ready to defend the one person she loved more than anyone else. The dinner that had begun as yet another night of humiliation was about to turn into the night no one in that family would ever forget. The laughter at the table grew louder, crueler, like knives scraping against Amina's heart. Grandma Ruth cackled again, her voice sharp and mocking, as if every word was meant to crush. Amina kept her eyes on her plate, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady her fork. She thought she could swallow the hurt one more time, pretend she didn't care, pretend her daughter wasn't noticing. But she was wrong. Zara had been watching, listening, and feeling every wound thrown at her mother. The little girl's chest rose and fell quickly, her small hands shaking as she gripped her fork tighter. And then, in a moment no one expected, she slammed it down on her plate with a loud clang. The sound cut through the laughter like lightning splitting the sky. All eyes turned to the child, shocked. Zara's tiny frame looked fragile, but her eyes burned with fire far bigger than her age. She stood up on her chair, her voice small but unshaken. "Maybe she's single because she doesn't want to marry people like you who laugh at her," she cried, her words sharp and fearless. The room froze. You could hear the silence, thick and heavy, wrapping around every person there. But Zara wasn't finished. Her face turned toward her grandmother, then to the uncles, then to her aunt who had flashed her ring. "My mommy is the strongest and kindest person here," she said firmly. "She's not alone. She has me." The air seemed to vanish. Jaws dropped, forks paused mid-air, and even the ticking of the wall clock felt louder than the stunned room. A spoon slipped from someone's hand and clattered onto the floor, breaking the silence for only a second before the hush grew deeper. The same relatives who had mocked now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their smug smiles wiped away by the truth that had come from a child. No one dared to laugh anymore. No one dared to meet Amina's eyes. Grandma Ruth's face drained of color. For years she had ruled these dinners with her sharp tongue and iron grip. No one had ever stood up to her, no one had dared. But now a 6-year-old had done what generations of adults never could. The power slipped from her hands in an instant, shattered by the raw honesty of Zara's voice. She tried to speak, but her lips quivered. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound never came. The truth was already too loud, echoing inside the room, impossible to deny. Amina sat frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She looked at her daughter, this small, brave girl who had spoken with more courage than she ever had. Tears blurred her vision, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of pride. In that single moment, her humiliation turned into strength. She realized she was not as alone as she thought. She had a daughter who loved her enough to silence an entire room. And nothing in the world was stronger than that. The moment Zara's words left her mouth, the entire room froze as if time itself had stopped. It felt like lightning had struck the table, leaving everyone stunned in its shock. Her small voice, sharp and unfiltered, seemed to bounce off the walls and echo back into every ear that had once been laughing. The same people who had been whispering cruel things about her mother just moments earlier were now sitting stiff, their eyes wide, their smiles gone. A spoon slipped from someone's hand and clattered loudly onto the floor, making the silence even heavier. Every cousin who had smirked before now avoided looking at Amina, shifting in their seats, suddenly uncomfortable in the truth spoken by a child. Grandma Ruth, the woman who never lost a battle of words, sat frozen in her chair. Her face lost its color, her lips parted as if she wanted to fire back, but nothing came out. For the first time, her arrogance was shaken. She had ruled the family table for years with her sharp remarks and cutting laughter, but now she was struck down by the honesty of a 6-year-old. The room that once echoed with her cackles was now filled with nothing but heavy silence. The power she had always carried slipped through her trembling hands. The uncles who had whispered about Amina's failed life coughed awkwardly, pretending to sip their drinks, trying to hide their shame. The cousins who had chuckled earlier stared at their plates as if the food had suddenly become fascinating. Even Amina's younger sister, who had flaunted her diamond ring with pride, now twisted it nervously, her smugness gone. No one dared to meet Amina's eyes, because in their hearts they knew Zara had spoken the truth they had all been too afraid to say. The air felt different, heavier but also clearer. It was as if Zara's words had peeled back the mask of the family, exposing their cruelty for what it was. No adult had ever challenged Grandma Ruth, no one had ever defended Amina, yet here was a child, breaking the chains of silence with her innocent courage. The family that once found joy in mocking Amina now sat in quiet shame, their power drained away by the boldness of a little girl who refused to let her mother be humiliated. Amina sat in disbelief, her heart racing as she watched the shift unfold before her eyes. She could hardly believe what her daughter had done, how a small voice had shattered years of mockery in just a few seconds. Tears stung her eyes, but this time they weren't from pain. They were tears of something new, hope, pride, and freedom. In that silence, Amina realized something had changed forever. Her daughter had broken the cycle, and nothing in that room would ever be the same again. Amina sat frozen, her body stiff, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She could hardly believe what had just happened. For years, she had carried the weight of humiliation, swallowing insults and pretending not to hear the whispers about her life. Every cruel remark from her grandmother, every mocking smirk from her cousins, had pushed her deeper into silence. She had cried so many times when no one was watching, broken by the shame of being called a failure. But tonight felt different. Tonight, her eyes blurred with tears again, but these were not tears of humiliation. These were tears of pride, pure and strong, because her 6-year-old daughter had stood up and spoken the words she herself had never been brave enough to say. Her little Zara, with her tiny hands and fiery eyes, had broken the chain that had tied her down for so long. Amina felt her chest swell with a new kind of strength. She had thought her daughter was too young to understand the cruelty, too innocent to notice the sharp edges of laughter. But she was wrong. Zara had seen it all, and instead of being silent like the others, she had chosen to fight for her mother. That simple act turned Amina's shame into power, her weakness into courage. She looked at her daughter through her tears, her heart whispering, "This is my child. This is my voice through her." The reaction around the table only made the moment stronger. Amina's younger sister, who had once twisted her diamond ring proudly in the light, now lowered her eyes in embarrassment. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the sparkle of her ring no longer feeling like victory but like guilt. The uncles who had whispered just minutes ago sat quietly, their mouths shut, their earlier arrogance gone. Even the cousins who had smirked could not meet Amina's gaze. The mocking looks had disappeared, replaced by the shame of being silenced by a child's honesty. And then there was Grandma Ruth. Her face, once so full of fire and superiority, was pale and shaken. She tried to lift her chin and recover her pride, but her hands trembled slightly against the table. She muttered something under her breath, but her voice cracked, weak and uncertain. The woman who had always spoken with authority now looked smaller, her power shattered by the fearless voice of her great-grandchild. Amina wiped her tears slowly, but she didn't try to hide them. For the first time, she let her family see her cry without shame. These were not the tears they had seen before, not the ones that made them laugh harder at her pain. These tears carried pride, love, and a strength no insult could ever take away. In that moment, Amina knew she was no longer the woman defined by failure. She was the mother of a fearless little girl who had turned humiliation into honor, and nothing would ever be the same again. Grandma Ruth had always been the loudest voice at the table. For years she had controlled every gathering with her sharp remarks, her sarcastic laughter, and her fearless tongue. No one dared to speak back because they all knew she would crush them with words. She was the queen of insults, the one who never lost a verbal battle. But tonight, when little Zara spoke, something broke. The room that usually echoed with her power was now silent, and for the first time, all eyes were not on her, but on the child who had dared to stand against her. Grandma Ruth tried to recover, forcing a laugh, but it sounded weak, hollow, and broken. "Children don't understand these things," she muttered, her tone shaky. She wanted to brush it off, to act as if the words of a 6-year-old meant nothing, but her voice betrayed her. It cracked in the middle, and everyone heard it. Her hands, once steady and commanding, trembled slightly as she tried to pick up her glass. The woman who had spent decades humiliating others was suddenly the one who looked exposed. The truth had already landed, and it was heavy. Everyone at the table could feel it. It wasn't just Zara's words, it was the way she had spoken them, so pure, so fearless, without any hesitation. Adults had always stayed quiet, too scared to challenge Ruth, but a child had cut through all the fear and stripped away her cruelty in seconds. No clever argument, no raised voice, no long speech could match the raw honesty that Zara had delivered. And Ruth knew it. Her power was gone, not because someone had fought her, but because someone had spoken the truth with nothing but love and courage. The uncles who once laughed along with her now looked down at their plates, pretending to eat, but the shame was written on their faces. The cousins who had always supported her with giggles sat stiff, not daring to look up. Even Amina's younger sister, once full of pride, avoided Ruth's gaze. The woman who had ruled the family with her tongue was now sitting in the same silence she had forced on others for years. Amina watched quietly, still holding her daughter's hand under the table. She could feel Zara's small fingers curled around hers, steady and strong, giving her more courage than she had ever felt. For the first time, she saw her grandmother not as the giant who had always towered over her life, but as a fragile old woman whose cruelty had finally been defeated. The silence stretched longer, and Ruth tried again to laugh, but the sound was thin, almost pitiful. The fear she once inspired was gone. The room had shifted, the balance had changed, and everyone knew it. The queen of the table had been dethroned, not by an argument, not by another elder, but by the simple and fearless honesty of a child who refused to let her mother be shamed. And nothing Ruth could say would ever take that moment back. The silence in the room felt like a heavy blanket pressing down on everyone. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. The echoes of Zara's brave words still lingered in the air, and they were louder than any insult that had ever been thrown at Amina. For a long moment, all that could be heard was the clinking of plates and the faint ticking of the wall clock. And then, breaking the silence, came a sound no one expected, Amina's father clearing his throat. He looked directly at Grandma Ruth, his voice steady but awkward, and said, "Ease up, Ruth." That was too much. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that shook the table. Never before had anyone dared to speak against her, not even him. But tonight, emboldened by Zara's courage, he finally broke his own silence. The effect was instant. Ruth's eyes widened, shocked to be challenged by the very man who had always kept quiet. She opened her mouth as if to snap back, but nothing came. The room knew it too, the era of her unchecked cruelty was cracking apart. Her power wasn't just weakened by a child's fearless honesty, it was collapsing because others were finally finding the courage to stand with the truth. The uncles who once joined Ruth's whispers now avoided her eyes, ashamed of their part in it. The cousins who had laughed earlier sat straight-backed, their smirks gone, their pride crushed. Even Amina's sister, the one who had proudly shown off her diamond ring, lowered her gaze and fidgeted with her hands. The balance had shifted, and it was visible in every bowed head and every guilty face. The queen of the table was no longer in control. And at the center of it all sat Amina, her hand wrapped around her daughter's. For the first time in years, she did not feel small. She did not feel weak. She did not feel ashamed. Instead, she felt tall, strong, and unshaken. Her daughter's words had given her a voice, and now the silence of others proved that they all knew the truth, she was not the failure they had painted her to be. She was a mother raising a fearless child, and that was more powerful than any ring, any whisper, or any cruel laugh. From that night onward, nothing was the same at family gatherings. The mocking comments stopped, the jokes about her life disappeared, and Ruth's laughter no longer carried the same sting. People looked at Amina differently, not with pity, but with respect, even if they didn't say it out loud. She was no longer seen as the weak one at the table. She was the mother of the little girl who had dared to do what no one else could, speak the truth that silenced an entire room. And that truth changed everything. As the dinner finally ended, Amina rose from her chair with Zara's small hand tucked safely in hers. Together they walked out of the house, step by step, but Amina felt as though she was floating. Her shoulders, which had carried years of shame and whispers, now felt light. For the first time in so long, she felt taller, freer, stronger. The sting of her grandmother's sneer no longer sat heavy in her chest. Instead, it was her daughter's brave words that rang in her ears, steady and powerful. The label she had worn for years, single, 36-year-old failure, was gone. Torn apart in one night by the courage of a child who loved her enough to speak out. In its place was a new image, one that could never be erased. Amina was not a woman to be pitied, not a sister to be mocked, not a daughter to be scolded. She was the mother of a fearless girl who had dared to silence cruelty with nothing but truth. And that truth had changed everything. Behind them, the family sat in a silence that would not be forgotten. Every laugh, every smirk, every cruel word was now stained with shame. They would remember that night forever, the night a 6-year-old, with fire in her eyes, spoke louder than all their cruelty. And they would remember Amina, no longer weak in their eyes, but strong in her silence, proud in her tears, and unbreakable in her daughter's love. Walking into the cool Kampala night, hand in hand with Zara, she knew one thing for sure: this was not just her daughter's mic drop. It was their legacy.